The Alamo, 1836. The most famous frontiersman in America is about to die in this fort, and the strangest thing about him is not how he dies. It is that a few years earlier, at the height of his fame, he stood up and threw his entire career into the fire on purpose, to defend the very people the legend of the frontier is supposed to be conquering. His name is Davy Crockett, and almost nothing you think you know about him is true. You know the coonskin cap, the grin, the king of the wild frontier, the bear hunter who could do no wrong. That man is mostly an invention, built by other people, most of it after he was already dead. The real one spent his life fighting that cartoon. He wrote a book to stop the lies about himself, and it did not work. He stood in the Congress of the United States and voted against the most powerful man in the country, on the one question where doing right could only destroy him, and it destroyed him. And when he finally rode down to Texas, broken, beaten, into a fort that everyone inside already knew was doomed, he walked toward that death as if he had chosen it. And here is the part that has never been settled. We know he died at the Alamo. Everyone knows that. But how he died, in the last hour, in the smoke, before the sun came up, is a question that 200 years have never once been able to answer. Some say he died the way the legend needs him to die, swinging his rifle to the last, buried under the men he had fought. Others say something quieter and much harder to sit with, that he was taken alive in the final minutes, one of a small handful, and that what happened next was not a battle at all. What if the most celebrated frontier hero in American history was mistaken for a cartoon by the very country that loved him? What if the bravest thing he ever did happened in a marble room, and not on any battlefield? And what if the plain fact of how he died was quietly buried, because the truth was harder to look at than the statue? We're going to stand in that last morning before this night is over. I promise you. But not yet, because to feel the weight of that question, you first have to know the man it happened to. And the man is a great deal stranger and a great deal realer than the cartoon we were handed. So settle in. If you have come here to fall asleep, you're in exactly the right place, and you do not have to fight it for a second. There is nothing in this story you need to keep hold of. You will not miss anything. Let the words go soft at the edges. Let your eyes close whenever they would like to. I will keep talking, low and slow, all the way through to morning, and the story will carry itself without any help from you. And before your eyes close all the way, do one small thing for me. Leave a comment and tell me where you are and what the hour is where you're lying right now. Maybe it is late in the evening in Denver, and the heat has just clicked on in the walls. Maybe it is the deep middle of the night in Lagos. Maybe it is a pale grey, almost morning in Melbourne, and you have not managed to sleep at all. I like knowing you are out there, scattered across the turning dark, all of us awake together for a little while. So tell me, and then let yourself drift. Here is where we are going tonight, gently, with nowhere to be. We're going to start with a barefoot boy in the Tennessee woods, a boy nobody would ever have picked out for anything. We're going to watch him become a hunter, and then a soldier, and then, almost by accident, a politician, and then something rarer than any of those, a genuine folk hero while he still drew breath. We're going to follow him all the way to the moment he stood up in the Congress of the United States and said no to the most powerful man in the country and lost nearly everything for it. And then we are going to follow him down to Texas, into that cold fort, into those 13 days, and finally into the dark of that last morning, where the question waits that no one has ever answered. What really happened to David Crockett? Let us go back to the beginning and walk toward it slowly together. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Davy Crockett. Go on. Almost certainly you're seeing a coonskin cap, a buckskin coat, a long rifle, a big easy grin, the king of the wild frontier, a man half made of tall tales, grinning his way through a world of bears and rivers and impossible feats. That picture is bright and warm and very, very hard to see past. It is also, in large part, an invention. That grinning frontier giant was built by other people, some while he lived, most after he died. There were joke books sold cheaply on newsstands, the Crockett almanacs, full of wild stories in which he wrings the tail off a comet and rides lightning like a horse and grins bears into submission. There were stage plays, and more than 100 years later there was a television show and a song about the king of the wild frontier and a whole nation of children in fake fur caps. Layer on layer on layer, until the actual man was buried somewhere far underneath, harder to reach than any treasure. And even the cap, that famous cap, is mostly costume. The real Crockett wore it sometimes, sure, the way any frontier hunter might. But the cap you are picturing belongs more to an actor than to a man. It was placed on his head, again and again, by people who needed him to be simple, a grinning symbol, an easy legend. The truth is that David Crockett spent a good part of his own life fighting that very legend. He watched other men get rich turning him into a joke, and it annoyed him, and near the end of his life he did something about it. He sat down and wrote his own book, his own account of his own life, partly just to say, in effect, that is not who I am, let me tell you who I actually was. He wanted to be taken as a real person. It may be the thing he least got. So tonight, let us do the thing he wanted. Let us take the cap off gently and set it aside and look at the man underneath. Because the man underneath is the one who died in that fort. And the man underneath is the one worth losing sleep over. He was not born a legend. He was born poor in a cabin to people who had almost nothing at all. He was born on the 17th of August, 1786, in the far eastern hills of what would become Tennessee, near a river with the soft, strange name of the Nolichucky. It was rough country then. Steep green ridges, cold, fast creeks, forest in every direction. The sort of land where a family scratched a living out of the dirt and the game and hoped the winter would be kind. His father was a man who tried a great many things and never quite got ahead of his debts. There was a mill once that a flood swept away. There was later a small tavern on a wagon road, a place for travellers to stop where the boy David grew up around the talk of strangers passing through. There was no money. There was no schooling to speak of, not at first, and there was, hanging over the whole household, that quiet, grinding pressure of a family always a little behind, always owing someone. When David was about 12, his father did a thing that was ordinary for the time and still lands hard when you sit with it. He hired the boy out, sent him off on foot with a stranger, a cattle driver, to help walk a herd hundreds of miles to the east, as a way of earning money the family needed. A 12-year-old gone out into the country with a man he did not know. And here, this early, you already see the thing that would define him. Because when the job was done, the man did not want to let him go. Tried to keep him on. And the boy, far from home, with no money and no help and nobody coming for him, simply decided to leave. Slipped out before dawn in deep snow and started walking home across the mountains by himself. Think about that boy for a second. Small, cold, alone. Walking into the dark because staying was worse. He made it home, and not long after, there was trouble at the little school his father finally sent him to. A fight with another boy, a fear of the punishment waiting, and rather than face it, David ran again. Only this time he did not go home. He stayed gone for years. He was, at 13, 14, out in the world entirely on his own. He worked for wagoners. He worked on farms. He hired himself out for whatever a boy could earn, drifting through Virginia and back, learning the one great lesson of his childhood, which was that no one is going to save him, and he had better learn to save himself. He taught himself to read and figure, late, in bits and pieces, working off the cost of a few months of schooling with manual labour. By the time he came home for good, years later, he was nearly a grown man, and his own family barely knew him at the door. Hold on to that boy in the snow. He is going to matter. Everything the legend would later smooth into an easy grin was built on top of a childhood that was, in plain fact, hard and lonely and frightening. The self-reliance was real. It just did not come free. And keep him in mind for another reason too. That boy taught himself one lesson before he taught himself anything else. When the situation is hopeless and no one is coming, you do not lie down. You keep moving through the dark until the light comes. He would spend the rest of his life proving he had learned it, and the last time he proved it, there would be no light coming at all, and he would already know it, and he would stay anyway. But we are a long way from that fort yet. Somewhere in his late teens, David Crockett fell in love badly and more than once in the way young men do. The first time, it did not work out, and by his own account it nearly broke him. But then he met a young woman named Polly Finley at a frolic, a country dance. The kind of gathering where the whole scattered neighbourhood came together for a night of music and courting. And this time it held. They married in 1806. He was 20. He had, he later said, almost nothing to his name but a rented cabin and a borrowed start. They were poor and they were happy, and they began to do the thing that would define the rest of his life, the thing nearly everyone in that generation on that frontier did. They moved. They pushed west. You have to understand what that meant, because it is the current running under this whole story. In those years, there was a constant westward pressure among poor and restless families, a sense that the good land, the fresh start, the place where a man without money might finally get ahead, was always a little further on, over the next ridge, across the next river, and so people packed what little they had onto a wagon or a couple of horses and went, again and again, chasing a better piece of ground. Crockett did this over and over. He never stayed put for long. He would clear a patch, build a cabin, plant a crop, and within a few years the restlessness or the debts or the simple lure of somewhere better would take hold. And off they went again, deeper into the west of Tennessee, into wilder and emptier country. And in that wild country, he became the thing he was truly, deeply good at. Not farming. He was a middling farmer at best, and he would tell you so himself. He became a hunter, one of the best anyone had ever seen. Polly bore him children in those cabins, and then, in 1815, still a young woman, she died, leaving him with small children and a grief he did not say much about, because men of that time and place mostly did not. He remarried before long to a widow named Elizabeth, a practical union as much as a romantic one, two broken households joining to make one that could survive. Life on that frontier did not leave much room to stop and mourn. You buried who you buried, and you kept moving, because the winter was coming and the children had to eat, and to feed them, he hunted. Let me show you the hunter, because the hunter is where the legend actually starts, and unlike most of the legend, this part is nearly true. There was a stretch of a few years, out in the canebrakes and bottomlands of western Tennessee, when David Crockett hunted bears on a scale that is honestly hard to believe. By his own telling, and he was a storyteller, so take it with a little salt, but only a little. In one season alone, he killed 105 bears. 105 in a single season. Picture what that life actually looked like, because it is nothing like the cartoon. It was not a man grinning at a bear until it gave up. It was brutal, cold, exhausting work. It was going out into the winter woods with dogs and a rifle and staying out for days at a time. It was following the dogs into black canebrake so thick you could not see an arm's length ahead. It was sometimes going down into the dark of a bear's den because that was where the animal was and there was no other way. It was butchering and hauling hundreds of pounds of meat through snow and mud, back to a family that needed every ounce of it to get through to spring. He was extraordinarily good at it. He read the woods the way other men read a page. He knew the land, the weather, the animals, the way water moved and where game would be, with a depth of knowledge that came from 10,000 hours of paying attention, because his life and his children's lives depended on it. And here is a strange thing to sit with. This man, who could read a forest so completely, who knew exactly how every hunt would end before it began, would himself end in a way that no one has ever been able to read at all. The great tracker left, at the very last, no clear track. But that is 30 years and 1,000 miles away yet. For now, he is simply the best hunter in Tennessee, and about to become something he never planned to be. That was the real ground under the legend. Not tall tales, skill, hard, particular, hard-won skill, of exactly the kind a settled eastern country was already starting to romanticize because it was already starting to lose it. And that, in a strange way, is what made Crockett famous before he ever did anything famous. He was the real thing, the genuine frontiersman, at the precise moment America was falling in love with the idea of the frontiersman. He was a living version of a story the country wanted to tell about itself. All he had to do was walk into a room, tell a hunting tale in his plain backwoods way, and people were charmed halfway to worship. He was about to discover that this charm was worth something, not in the woods, in politics. But before we leave the woods, stay in them with me a little longer. Because the hunting is where you can actually watch the ordinary man turn into the thing the country would one day worship. And it is worth seeing up close, in the cold, the way he lived it. Picture a single winter. Not the legend of a winter, a real one. It is before dawn, and the temperature is below freezing and Crockett is already awake. Because the bears move in the cold, and a man who wants to eat moves with them. He has a handful of dogs, half-starved and fearless, and a long rifle he trusts more than most people, and a knife, and almost nothing else. He goes out into country so thick with cane that a man standing 6 feet away disappears, and he stays out. Not for an afternoon, for days, sleeping on the ground with a fire if he's lucky, and without one if he is not, following the dogs by the sound of their voices when he cannot see them at all. And here is a thing that happened, that he wrote down himself, and that no cartoon has ever dared to show you, because it is too strange and too real. One freezing night, far from home, soaked through and shaking, he found himself in danger of simply dying of the cold in the dark. There was no shelter. There was no way to get warm. So he found a fallen tree, a big one standing on its broken end, and for hours, all night long, he climbed it and slid back down it, over and over, up and down in the pitch black, using nothing but the heat of his own moving body to keep the cold from killing him, up and down a tree, alone, in the dark, until the light came. That is not a tall tale. That is a man doing arithmetic with his own life, The same arithmetic the boy in the snow had done, the same arithmetic he would do one last time in a fort in Texas. Hold that picture. The man climbing a tree all night to stay alive. We're going to need it later, because here is the strange machine at the center of Crockett's whole life, and I want you to feel it turning. The very skills that kept him alive out there, the toughness, the refusal to quit, the plain backwoods way of talking about it afterward, were about to make him famous in rooms he had never imagined entering. The country back east was, at that exact moment, growing soft and settled and a little ashamed of it, and hungry for a story about hard men in the woods. And here was a hard man in the woods who could tell the story himself and make you laugh while he did. He did not know yet that the woods were about to hand him to the world. But first, before the fame, before the politics, the world was going to hand him a war. And the war was going to put something inside him that he would carry, quietly, for the next 17 years, all the way to the most important vote of his life. But before the politics there was a war, and it left a mark on him that would take years to fully surface. In 1813, violence broke out on the southern frontier, part of the larger war the young United States was fighting at the time. A faction of the Creek people rose up, and after a settlement was attacked and many were killed, the frontier erupted in fear and fury. Militias formed, and David Crockett, hunter, husband, father, volunteered. He rode as a scout and a hunter for the army, which is to say he did in war what he did in peace, ranged ahead through the country, read the land, brought back game and information. He served under a sharp and ferocious general from Tennessee, a man whose name you know, Andrew Jackson. Remember that name. Jackson is going to become the hinge this entire story turns on. Crockett did not write much, later, about glory. What he wrote about, when he wrote about that war at all, was the other thing. He was present in the aftermath of an attack on a native town, and what he described was not a battle. It was a horror, the killing of people who were not fighting. Hunger so severe afterward that the soldiers dug through the ruins for anything to eat. He wrote about it plainly, without dressing it up, and you can feel, under the plain words, a man who had seen something he could not entirely square with himself. Let me take you into one moment of that war, because it is the moment that explains the most important thing he ever did, and almost no telling of the coonskin cap legend ever mentions it. The militia came upon a native town. What followed was not a battle between armies. The fighting turned into something else, something Crockett saw with his own eyes and never fully put down. People who were not soldiers died. The town was burned. And afterward there was a detail so grim that it tells you everything about how total the ruin was. The men, half-starved themselves, went down into the cellar of a burned building looking for food, and the food they found there was fouled by what the fire had done above it, and they were hungry enough that some of them ate it anyway. Crockett wrote about that later in his own plain words. He did not turn it into an adventure. He did not make himself a hero of it. He described it the way a man describes a thing that has stayed with him, a thing he cannot quite fit into the story he would prefer to tell about himself. You can feel reading it. A young man standing in the smoke of somebody else's destroyed home, understanding for the first time in his body what this frontier actually cost the people who were already living on it. He served his time. He came home. He went back once more when he was called, then came home for good, done with it. He was not a man built for the machinery of war, the following of the orders, the killing on command. He had gone because his neighbours went and the fear was real, and he came back quieter about the whole business than the legend of the grinning Indian fighter would ever admit. That experience, that early close look at what was done to native people on the frontier, sat in him. It did not turn him into a saint, and I am not going to pretend it did. He went home and got on with his life, and mostly did not speak of it. But it was in there, lodged, waiting. And nearly 20 years later, in a marble chamber in Washington, on the single most important day of his public life, it would come back out of him at the worst possible moment for his career, and the best possible moment for his soul. I am going to make you wait for that, the way he had to wait for it, through the years of hunting and fame that came in between. But keep it with you, a man in the smoke of a burned town, keeping quiet, remembering. It comes back. It always comes back. But we're not there yet. First, the accident that turned a hunter into a public man. It started as a joke, more or less. After the war settled in western Tennessee, Crockett was made a local magistrate, then an officer in the militia, small offices in a thin new settlement, and then some neighbours, half teasing, put him forward to run for the state legislature. He was a famous local character by then, the great bear hunter, a man who could hold a room. Why not send him to make the laws? So he ran. And the way he ran tells you everything about why he worked. He could not out-argue trained lawyers on the fine points of policy. He knew it. So he did not try. He got up in front of crowds of ordinary frontier people, farmers and hunters and squatters like himself, and he told them stories. He made them laugh. He talked like they talked, about the things they cared about, and he made no pretense of being their better. He was one of them, plainly and obviously, and they could feel it. And when the fancy candidates spoke in their fancy way, Crockett would follow with a joke that pricked the whole balloon, and the crowd would roar, and the votes would come. He won. And he found, to his own surprise, that he was suited to it, at least to the part that mattered to him, because he had come into public life carrying one real conviction, hardened out of his whole hungry childhood. The poor people out on that frontier were getting cheated on the land. Here is the thing that made Crockett more than a character. Out in the west of Tennessee, thousands of families had done exactly what his own family had always done. They had gone out into raw country, cleared it, built on it, farmed it, made it into something with the labour of their own hands. But the legal title to much of that land was tangled up, promised to other, wealthier interests, to the state, to speculators, to old claims from far away. And these poor settlers, the people who had actually done the work, were in danger of being told that the ground under their cabins was not theirs, that they would have to pay for it all over again or get off. Crockett looked at that and saw his father, saw his whole childhood, saw every family a little behind, always owing someone, always at the mercy of people with money and paper and power. And he made it the cause of his political life. He fought for years for a law that would let those poor settlers keep the land they had improved at a price they could actually pay. Think about how personal that was. This was not an abstract policy to him, a line in a platform. This was the exact trap his own family had lived inside his whole life. The endless owing, the ground never quite yours, the people with paper always able to take it back. He had climbed out of that trap by luck and nerve and a good story, and now he was in a position to pull other people out of it too, thousands of them, and he threw himself at it. He talked about it endlessly. He would not let it go. And here is the quiet tragedy folded into that fight, the one that decided everything. To win a law like that, out on the frontier of Tennessee, you needed the support of the powerful men who ran the state and the party, and the most powerful of them all, the rising star of Tennessee, the man whose blessing could pass a bill or bury it, was another self-made frontier soldier, a hard, proud, unforgiving man who had also come up from nothing and who was becoming, year by year, the most popular figure in the entire country. The same man Crockett had gone to war under. The same man who would soon be president. And the closer Crockett looked at how that man wanted to treat the poor and the powerless, the settlers he loved and worse, the native nations he had seen burned out of their towns, the more Crockett understood that he could not follow him. Not all the way. Not where this was going. That was the fight that carried him eventually all the way to Washington. And it was also, quietly, the fight that would destroy his career. Because to win it, he was going to have to cross the most powerful man in America, and Crockett was exactly stubborn enough and exactly honest enough to do it. In 1827, David Crockett was elected to the Congress of the United States. Picture the distance he had travelled. From a barefoot boy walking home alone through mountain snow, to a hungry teenager hiring himself out on the roads, to a hunter in the cane brakes, to the marble halls of the national capital. It is one of the great long-shot journeys in American life, and he made it in a single lifetime, on nothing but nerve and skill and that plain, irresistible charm. Washington did not quite know what to do with him, and the country, it turned out, loved him for it. Because here came this frontiersman, this genuine article, into the powdered and polished world of Eastern politics, and he refused to pretend to be anything but what he was. He told his hunting stories on the floor of Congress. He spoke in his backwoods way and made no apology for it. He was funny and shrewd under the humour and utterly unlike the lawyers and planters around him. Newspapers ate it up. Stories about him spread. Most of them exaggerated, many simply invented, a snowballing legend of the wild frontier congressman. And this is where the two Crocketts split apart. There was the man, working hard and mostly unsuccessfully to pass his land bill for poor settlers. And there was the legend, ballooning out into the newspapers and the joke books, a cartoon getting bigger and brighter and less true by the month. A stage play opened with a thinly disguised Crockett as its roaring frontier hero. The almanacs began, full of impossible tall tales with his name on them. He was becoming famous in a way almost no living person had ever been famous before, a folk hero in real time. And you can feel him, in his own writings, growing uneasy with it, sensing that the legend was getting away from him, that people were coming to see a character and not a man, that the roaring cartoon might swallow the actual person whole. He could not have known how right he was. But that uneasiness is part of why, when the true test of his life arrived, he met it not as a legend calculating his image, but as a man following his conscience straight off a cliff. And there is a grim irony waiting at the end of all this fame, one worth planting now so you feel it later. The country would spend 200 years telling and retelling the story of how this man died. It would paint him, film him, sing about him, put him on the wall, and in all that retelling with all that love, it would never actually settle the one thing that matters most, what really happened to him in that last hour. The most famous death in American history, and we cannot tell you how it happened. Keep that strange fact burning quietly as we go. The test had a name. It was called the Indian Removal Act. And nearly everyone around him, including every ounce of his own political interest, told him to vote yes. In 1830, the great political question burning through Washington was Indian removal. The man driving it was now the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. The same fierce General Crockett had scouted for in the Creek War, now the most powerful and popular man in the country, and a Tennessee man besides, Crockett's own state, Crockett's own party, Crockett's own people. And Jackson wanted a law that would force the native nations of the Southeast off their lands and drive them west, opening that vast territory to settlement. Everything Crockett knew about his own survival told him to vote yes. His district wanted it. His party demanded it. Jackson, a man who did not forgive, was watching. To cross the president on this was not brave, in the political sense. It was suicidal. It would end him. He voted no. He stood up, one of the very few from the entire region to do it, and he voted against the removal of the native nations. And by his own account he said in plain words that he did not care if it cost him his seat, that he had done what he believed was right, and that he would rather be politically dead and honest than alive and ashamed. Where did that come from? It came from the Creek War, from that young hunter who had walked through the aftermath of an attack on a native town and seen what he had seen and never quite gotten it out of his mind. It came from a lifetime of watching the powerful take from the powerless and knowing, from the inside, exactly how that felt. He would not put his hand to it, not even to save himself. And it did cost him. That vote, and his long feud with Jackson that grew out of it, marked him inside his own party as a traitor. The machine turned against him. He would win and lose his seat back and forth over the next few years, the ground crumbling under him, until at last, in 1835, he lost it for good. Now, I want to be honest with you here, the way this whole channel tries to be, because a man is never just one thing. Crockett was a frontiersman of his era, with his era's blind spots, and it would be a lie to hand you a spotless saint. But on this one enormous question, at the moment it counted, when doing right could only hurt him, he did right. He is one of the few who did, and it broke his career in half. There is a line people say he spoke after that final defeat to the voters who had turned him out. Whether he said it exactly this way we cannot be sure, but it rings true to everything else about him. He's supposed to have told them more or less, "You may all go to hell and I will go to Texas," and that is exactly what he did. So in the late autumn of 1835, a defeated, restless, nearly 50-year-old David Crockett pointed himself southwest toward Texas and rode out of his old life. Understand what Texas was in his mind, and in the mind of thousands of Americans like him. It was the next thing over the next river, the fresh start writ enormous. It was cheap land, wild country, a place where a man who had lost everything might build it all again. For a broke ex-congressman with a famous name and a wounded pride, it shimmered on the horizon like a second life. He went first just to look, to see the country, maybe to secure some land, maybe to find a new stage for his ambitions, and the country did not disappoint him. He rode into Texas and was by all accounts delighted by it. The land was rich and open and beautiful. People knew his name and welcomed him like the celebrity he was. He wrote home warm and hopeful letters. He thought he might bring the whole family down. He thought at last things might come right. Picture that journey for a moment, because it is the last stretch of ordinary life he would ever have, and he rode it not knowing that. A famous man in his late 40s, a little heavier than in his hunting days, moving southwest through raw new country on horseback. And everywhere he stopped, people knew him. That was the strange gift and the strange trap of his fame. He would ride into some rough Texas settlement, a scatter of cabins on the edge of nowhere, and men would put down their work and come out to see him, because the great Davy Crockett was here, in the flesh, the man from the almanacs and the newspapers. They gave him dinners, They asked him to speak, they followed him. In the letters he sent home, he sounds happier than he had in years, lighter, a man who had crawled out from under a crushing defeat and found, out here, that he was still loved, still somebody, still at the start of something instead of the end. And that is the cruel thing about those letters. Reading them now, he believed he was at a beginning. He wrote about the land he might claim, the future he might build, the family he might bring down to this beautiful open country. He had no idea, none, that he had a matter of weeks to live. He was riding, cheerful and hopeful, straight toward the most famous death in American history, and the last thing on his mind was dying. But he had ridden into the middle of something, because Texas in that winter was not a peaceful frontier. It was on the edge of open war, and to understand the fort he was riding toward, you have to understand, just for a few minutes, what that war was actually about. Not the simple version, the real one. Texas at that time was not part of the United States. It was the far northern frontier of Mexico. Mexico had won its own independence not long before, and in the years after, it had done something that mattered enormously to what came next. It had invited settlers from the United States to come and populate its thinly settled northern lands, and they had come in huge numbers, mostly from the American South, until in Texas these Anglo settlers vastly outnumbered the Mexican citizens around them. For a while it worked, but tensions built, the way they do, between a central government far away and a restless population that did not much want to be governed by it. When a strong-willed general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna took power in Mexico and moved to centralize it, to pull authority back to the capital and rule the provinces with a firmer hand, the Texans, Anglo settlers, and some Mexican Texans alike pushed back. By 1835, that pushing had become a shooting rebellion. Now here is the harder truth, the one the coonskin cap version leaves out, and honesty asks us to keep it in. The war was about liberty, yes. The settlers genuinely felt a distant government was trampling their rights, and that grievance was real. But it was also tangled right up inside that about slavery. Mexico had moved to abolish slavery. Many of the American settlers who had poured into Texas had come precisely to grow cotton, and cotton in their world meant enslaved labor. The freedom a good many of them were fighting for included explicitly the freedom to keep human beings as property on land where the Mexican government had tried to forbid it. I'm not telling you this to flatten the story into a single villain and a single victim, because it was not that simple either. Men fight for a knot of reasons at once, some noble, some ugly, and the men in that fort were no different, and Crockett himself came to it late, an outsider chasing a fresh start more than a cause. But if we're going to sit honestly with what happened at the Alamo, we cannot pretend the war was only the clean and shining thing the legend made it. It was liberty and it was slavery, braided together, the way so much of that century was. Hold both of those without forcing them into one, and now let us go to the fort. The Alamo was not really a fort. That is the first thing to understand. It was an old Spanish mission, built more than a century before, a church and a scatter of low buildings and a walled compound around them, raised by priests to convert and settle, not by soldiers to withstand an army. The famous church, the shape you picture, was a battered ruin without a roof. The walls were long and low and full of gaps, patched with timber and earth. It sprawled over too much ground for the number of men who would have to hold it. To a trained military eye it was close to indefensible, and into this place, in February of 1836, came a small collection of men to defend it. Somewhere between about 180 and 250 of them, the numbers are not certain. And that uncertainty is itself part of the fog we will keep meeting tonight. They were led, uneasily, by two very different men. There was a young officer named William Travis, formal and ambitious, only in his 20s, who commanded the regular soldiers. And there was Jim Bowie, a big, hard-living, famous frontier brawler, a man with a knife named after him, and a fearsome reputation, who led the volunteers and who was, by the time it mattered most, gravely ill, laid out on a cot, barely able to rise. And there, riding in with a handful of Tennessee men in the middle of all this, came David Crockett. He arrived as what he was, a celebrity, the most famous man in the fort by a distance, and he seems to have understood exactly what he was there for, and it was not to command. It was to hold the men together, to keep their spirits up in a place with every reason for despair. There is a detail that survives, small and human, and almost unbearably poignant when you know what is coming. He played the fiddle. In the evenings, inside those doomed walls, David Crockett played music to keep the men's hearts from sinking. At one point, the story goes, there was even a kind of contest of it, his fiddle against the bagpipes of a Scottish defender, the two of them making a joyful racket in the dark to hold the fear at bay. Sit with that image for a moment as you drift. A cold fort, a gathering army somewhere out in the night, and inside, a 50-year-old man, a long way from the Tennessee woods, playing the fiddle for frightened younger men, because that was the kindest and bravest thing left that he knew how to do. Then, on the 23rd of February, the army came. Santa Anna arrived with a force that would grow to several thousand, and he arrived in no mood for mercy. He had his men raise a flag over the town nearby, a red flag, and every defender in that fort knew exactly what red meant, because it was the oldest and simplest message in the language of siege. No quarter, no prisoners, no surrender accepted. Everyone inside would die. That was the answer to the question the men in the Alamo faced from the first hour. There would be no walking out of this, and so began 13 days that have burned themselves into memory. 13 days. Let that number settle, because I am going to say it more than once tonight, the way the defenders must have counted it. 13 days of a small band of men in a broken mission, ringed by an army that grew larger every day, under a red flag that promised them death. 13 days of cannon fire, the Mexican guns walking closer, night after night, wearing at the walls and at the nerves of the men behind them. 13 days of almost no sleep, of standing watch in the cold, of watching the ring of enemy campfires thicken on the dark horizon. 13 days of waiting for help that, in the end, was never going to come in time. The young commander, Travis, wrote letters out into that dark. Riders slipped through the enemy lines carrying them, appeals to Texas and to the wider American world, calls for reinforcement, for anyone to come. One of those letters became one of the most famous documents in American history, a young man's defiant cry that he would never surrender and never retreat, and that he would die like a soldier. Read it now, and it is almost too much to bear, because you know, as he half knew, that almost no one was coming. A few did come. A small band of riders broke through the enemy lines in the night and came into the fort, choosing to join the doomed rather than leave them alone. That is nearly the whole of the help that ever arrived. A handful of men who rode toward the red flag on purpose. There is a legend from these days that you have probably heard. The story that Travis gathered the men, drew a line in the dirt with his sword, and asked all those willing to stay and die to step across it, and that all but one did. It is a powerful story. It may even hold a grain of something true. But I have to be honest with you, it first appeared many years later, and most historians regard it as almost certainly a later invention, a piece of myth grown over the real thing. The real thing needs no line in the sand. The real thing is simply that these men stayed, night after freezing night, knowing how it would end, and did not run. Now let me slow the siege down, and let you feel it the way the men inside felt it. One day bleeding into the next, because 13 days is not a number when you are living it. It is an eternity, and then it is not enough time at all. The first days were almost the worst in a way, because they still held a thread of hope. The men believed help might come. Texas knew they were here. Surely, they told each other, an army was forming somewhere out there. Riders were carrying the word. Reinforcements were on the road. So they worked. They shored up the broken walls with timber and earth. They placed their cannon. They rationed what little they had. And at night, when the work was done and the cold came down, that is when a man's mind turns on him. Lying on the stone, listening to the enemy camp, doing the arithmetic of how many they were out there and how few in here. And this is where Crockett mattered, and where you can see exactly why the men were so glad to have him. He was not a commander. He did not draw up the defence. What he did was walk the walls. He was everywhere, by every account, the most famous man in the fort, refusing to sit apart and be famous. He took a position on one of the most exposed stretches of the defences, a weak wooden palisade, the kind of spot you give to the man you trust most because it is the spot most likely to break. He told his stories. He kept men laughing in a place with nothing to laugh about. And in the evenings he played that fiddle, the sound of it going up into the dark over the walls, out toward an army that was there to kill every man who could hear it. Try to actually be there for a moment as you drift. It is the middle of the night. It is cold. You have not truly slept in days. The cannon have been firing on and off, not always to breach the walls, but to break your rest, to keep you from ever closing your eyes fully. And through all of it, from somewhere along the wall comes the thin, bright sound of a fiddle, played by a 50-year-old man from Tennessee, who is as trapped as you are, and who has decided that the last useful thing he can do on this earth is keep your spirits off the floor for one more night. The cannon fire was not random, and this is a detail worth holding, because it points at everything to come. Santa Anna did not simply try to smash the walls down. Night after night he moved his guns a little closer, and he kept up a fire designed as much to exhaust the defenders as to destroy the fort. Because a rested defender and an exhausted one are two different men when the real attack finally comes. He was wearing them down on purpose, grinding away their sleep day after day, so that when he chose his moment, the men on the walls would be as hollowed out and slow as 13 days of terror could make them. And the help never came. That is the part that sits heaviest. Travis wrote his letters, and the riders carried them out through the enemy lines at enormous risk, and the words reached the world, and the world was moved by them, and it was not enough, and it was not fast enough. A small group did break through in the night to join them, riders who chose to enter a place everyone else was trying to escape. But the army that would have saved them never assembled in time. The men in the Alamo were, in the most literal sense, watching the horizon for a rescue that the rest of us know, with 200 years of hindsight, was never going to arrive. Did they know it too by the end? That is one of the quiet, unanswerable questions inside the larger one. Somewhere in those last days the hope must have thinned out and gone. There must have been a night when the men stopped truly believing anyone was coming and understood, fully, that they were going to die here, and stayed anyway. We do not know exactly when that night was. We do not know what was said. But it happened in the dark behind those walls, and every man made his peace with it in his own silence. And Crockett was one of them, the most famous man in America, who had climbed out of poverty by luck and nerve and a good story, who had stood up in Congress and thrown his career away for his conscience, who'd come to Texas looking for one more fresh start, understanding now, on a cold wall in the dark, that there would be no more fresh starts. Just this, just the 13th day, coming. By the 12th night, the 13th day was coming, and Santa Anna decided he had waited long enough. In the small cold hours of the 6th of March, in the dark before any light, the army moved. I told you at the very beginning that Crockett was almost certainly already awake, and here is why. After 13 days of bombardment, the guns had fallen quiet in the night, and that silence was itself a weapon. 13 days the cannon had thundered, and the men had learned to live inside the noise, to sleep in snatches against it. And then, in the small hours of the 13th night, it stopped. The quiet came down, and an exhausted garrison, worn past the edge of what a body can take, at last sank into the first real sleep it had known in nearly 2 weeks. That was the moment Santa Anna had been waiting 13 days to reach. That was why he had ground their sleep away night after night. He sent his columns forward across the open ground in the dark, in the silence, hoping to reach the walls before the men on them ever woke. Picture it from the wall, in the last minute before it began. You are a sentry. It is black and freezing, and for the first time in 13 days, quiet. Most of the men behind you are finally, deeply asleep. You're staring out into a dark that gives you nothing, and then the dark makes a sound. Not one sound, 1,000 sounds. Boots, breath. The soft, enormous rustle of an army already far too close, already almost at the wall, rising out of the ground where a moment ago there was nothing. They almost reached the walls unheard. But in the last stretch, some of the attacking soldiers, swept up in the charge, began to cry out, and the sound carried, and the sentries came awake to the worst sight of their lives, the ground itself seeming to move, dark masses of men rushing in from every side at once and no time left, none to do anything but shout the alarm and begin to fight. I am going to keep what happened next gentle, because there is no need to dwell on the horror of it, and because you are trying to sleep, and because the men who died there deserve to be remembered as more than the manner of their dying. But I want you to feel the shape of it, because the shape is the tragedy. For 13 days these men had held, 13 days against an army that outnumbered them beyond all reason, and the end, when it finally came, did not take 13 days, or 13 hours. It took something close to a single hour. The first rushes were thrown back. For a few furious minutes the defenders' fire was terrible, and the attacking columns fell in heaps at the base of the walls, and it must have seemed, impossibly, as though the thin line of men might hold one more time. It could not hold. There were simply too many. The columns pulled back, reformed, and came again, and this time they reached the walls and got over them at a corner, and once even a few enemy are over the wall of a place like that, a place too large for too few, the whole defence begins to come apart at once. Men had to leave their posts to meet the breach, and that opened other posts, and the army poured through every gap the shifting made. And so the last defence of the Alamo was not a line. It was a scattering. The fighting broke into 100 separate, desperate struggles across the compound in the dark, men falling back from the walls toward the old church and the low barrack rooms, fighting from doorways, from behind cannon, room by room, each knot of defenders making its own last stand in its own corner as the light had not yet even come up. Bowie, too sick to rise, is said to have died on his cot, still fighting in the only way a dying man could. Travis, the young letter writer who had sworn he would never surrender, is said to have fallen early up on the wall near his guns, close to where he had written those words. One by one, in the smoke and the dark and the first grey hint of a dawn that most of them would not see, the defenders of the Alamo were overwhelmed, and somewhere in that hour David Crockett died. Somewhere, in that hour. That much, and only that much, we can say for certain. Now stop for a moment. Let the noise fade. Because we've arrived, at last, after this whole long night, at the question I made you a promise about at the very beginning, and it deserves a breath of silence before we open it. Everyone knows he died here. Everyone knows the Alamo and Crockett and the Last Stand. It is one of the most retold mornings in the entire American story, and not one person who has ever lived can tell you, for certain, how it actually happened. How? Here is where I have to slow all the way down and be as honest with you as I know how to be. Because this is the heart of the whole thing, and it is genuinely, truly unresolved. There are two very different stories about how David Crockett met his end, and we cannot be certain which is true. The first is the one you already know, the one the legend needs. In this version, Crockett dies in the thick of the fighting, rifle in hand, going down swinging in the last stand, one of the last to fall, his body found afterward ringed by the enemy dead he had taken with him. It is the heroic death, the storybook death, the one painted on the walls of memory and filmed a dozen times. For a long time it was simply accepted as what happened. But there is a second story, and it is quieter and much harder to sit with. In this version, when the fighting ended, a small handful of defenders, perhaps a half dozen, were found still alive, taken prisoner in the final moments, and one of them was Crockett, and these men were brought before Santa Anna. And Santa Anna, furious, and bound by that red flag of no quarter, ordered them killed on the spot, and they were. Not in battle, after it, unarmed. Where does this second story come from? Its most important source is the account of a Mexican officer named José Enrique de la Peña, who was there in Santa Anna's army that morning. De la Peña left behind a written narrative of the campaign, and inside it is a passage describing exactly this, the final assault ending, and a small group of defenders, perhaps half a dozen, being brought forward alive. Among them, he wrote, was a man of some standing and dignity, older than the rest, whom he understood to be the well-known traveller and former congressman from Tennessee. And this man and the others with him were, on Santa Anna's order, killed on the spot by soldiers who fell on them with their blades, against the protests of some of the officers present, who felt that killing unarmed prisoners this way was beneath them. Now sit with what a strange and heavy object that account is, because its whole history is a mystery of its own, wrapped around the mystery of Crockett's death. For a long time, hardly anyone knew the De la Peña narrative existed. When it did surface and was published in the 20th century, it detonated. Because if it was true, it took the single most sacred image in the whole Texas story, the hero going down swinging, and quietly replaced it with something far more uncomfortable. The hero on his knees, unarmed, killed after the fighting was already over, and a great many people did not want to hear it. So the fight began, and it went on for decades, and at times it turned genuinely bitter. Some insisted the document was a forgery, a fake written long after the fact by someone who wanted to sell a sensation. They picked at the paper, the ink, the handwriting, the way the account had come down through the years. Others, historians and document experts, studied that same physical manuscript with enormous care and came away convinced it was real, an authentic narrative written by a real officer who had truly been in that army on that morning. The weight of expert opinion, after all the testing, leaned toward genuine. But leaning toward genuine is not the same as certainty, and even if the document is real, a second question remains that no test can settle. Was De La Peña right about who the older man was? He was an enemy officer in the chaos and smoke of a battle's end, looking at a group of prisoners he did not personally know. He believed one of them was Crockett. He may have been correct. He may have been repeating what others around him were saying. He may have been wrong. Do you see the shape of it? There are two locked doors here, not one. First, is the account authentic? And second, even if it is, was the dignified older man really Crockett, or someone else the officer took for him? You can get past the first door and still be standing at the second, and behind the second door, the smoke never clears. There is more feeling bound up in this than in almost any other argument in American history, and it is worth understanding why. Because the two versions of Crockett's death are not just two facts. They are two completely different meanings. In one, a man chooses to fight to the last breath and dies on his feet, and a nation gets the pure, clean, heroic ending it wants. In the other, a man survives the battle only to be killed helpless a few minutes later, and the ending is not clean at all. It is a small, cruel murder in the aftermath of a slaughter. People do not fight so hard over the first version because they love history. They fight because they love the meaning, and they are afraid of losing it. And here, I think, is the honest place to land, and it is not a comfortable one. We do not know. We do not know how David Crockett died. Both stories have their evidence and their defenders. It is entirely possible that he went down fighting in the dark. It is entirely possible that he was among those taken at the end and killed a few minutes later, unarmed, on the orders of an angry general. The fog of that hour, the chaos, the smoke, the conflicting accounts written by frightened and partisan people on every side, has never fully lifted, and it may never lift. And you are allowed to hold both pictures at once tonight without forcing them together. The man going down swinging and the man taken alive and killed just after. One of them is what happened. We have simply lost track of which. And there is something almost fitting for a man so buried under legend that he fought his own myth while he lived, that the last and deepest fact about him, the how of his death, should be the one thing the legend can never quite pin down. What we can say is this: however it came, in the fighting or just after it, he did not run and he did not survive, and he died there in that broken mission, a long way from the Tennessee hills where a barefoot boy once walked home alone through the snow. The rest is smoke. By the middle of that morning it was over. Every defender was dead. What Santa Anna did next is part of why the fog never lifted. He ordered the bodies of the defenders gathered and burned, and with that order he created a second mystery, a smaller shadow of the first, that has also never been solved, because there was no row of marked graves, no careful burial, nothing for later generations to stand over and say, "Here, this one was Crockett." The men of the Alamo went up together into smoke over the Texas plain, and where exactly their ashes came to rest afterward is itself uncertain, argued over, never fully settled to this day. Some were said to be gathered up later and buried. Where precisely is disputed. So think about what that means. We do not know for certain how Crockett died, and we do not know for certain where any part of him lies now. The most famous man in America, and by the end of that morning he had slipped out of the record's hands twice over, once in the manner of his death, and once in the resting place of his body. He has no grave you can visit with any certainty, only monuments raised later to a memory. Two open questions then, standing over the same man. Hold them both as we come down toward the end. And here is the terrible irony that closes the story. Santa Anna thought he had won. He had wiped out the defenders to the last man, made a fearful example, and he expected the rebellion to collapse in terror. Instead, he had done the opposite. He had made martyrs. The news of the Alamo, of the small band who held for 13 days and died to the last under a flag of no quarter, swept across Texas and across the United States, and it did not frighten people. It enraged them. It became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo. Weeks later, a Texan army caught Santa Anna's forces and shattered them in a battle that lasted barely 18 minutes, screaming that very cry, and Texas won its independence. David Crockett did not live to see any of it. He had been dead only weeks. He never knew that the fort where he died would become the most famous defeat in American memory, or that his own name, already a legend while he lived, would now be fused forever to that place and that morning. And the legend, freed at last from the inconvenient living man, grew without limit. The almanacs got wilder, the plays multiplied. More than a century later, a television show and a song would put a coonskin cap on the head of every child in the country, and the king of the wild frontier would grin down from 1,000 lunchboxes, and the actual David Crockett, the poor boy, the uneasy congressman, the man who voted his conscience and lost, the man who played the fiddle in a doomed fort to comfort frightened boys, would sink almost out of sight beneath the cartoon. That is the thing worth staying awake to notice, if anything is. A nation needed a certain kind of hero, and so it took a real and complicated man, and it sanded him down into a grin and a cap and a last stand. It needed him to die swinging, so mostly it decided that he did. It needed the war to be simple and shining, so mostly it forgot the harder parts. The legend is not a lie exactly. It is a real man, pressed flat and painted bright, until he was easy to love and easy to hang on a wall. Tonight we did the other thing. We took the cap off and looked underneath, and what was underneath was better than the legend, harder and sadder and a great deal more human. So let the fort go quiet now. The guns have long since stopped. The smoke has long since cleared. It has been quiet on that plain for nearly 200 years. You do not have to carry any of it with you into sleep. Let it settle where it lands. The boy in the snow, the hunter in the canebrake, the plain-spoken man standing up in a marble room to vote no when every clever calculation told him to vote yes, the fiddle in the dark of a doomed mission. The one question we could not answer, and did not pretend to. Somewhere tonight the ground where that fort stood is still there, in the middle of a city that grew up all around it, and the people who walk past it by day mostly do not know the half of what happened there, and that is all right. The story does not need them to know it to be true. It was true whether or not anyone remembered it correctly. It stayed true all the way down under the cap and the grin and the song. If any of this kept you company tonight, you can leave a quiet like before you drift off, the way you might leave a single light burning in another room, just so I know you are there and would like more nights like this. And if you would like me to keep going, keep finding the real people hidden inside the legends we only think we know, and telling them slowly, in the dark, at exactly this pace, then you are welcome to follow along, and I will keep bringing them. And if you have a moment left before sleep takes you, tell me once more where you are, and what the night is doing outside your window. Rain or snow, or a hot still dark, or the hum of the city that never fully sleeps. Because every famous name was once just a person, frightened and brave and unsure before the world flattened them into a story. Crockett was. So was everyone whose name you know. There is a real human being under every legend, and they were all once, as awake and uncertain in their own long nights as you are in this one. So close your eyes. Tennessee is still green tonight, somewhere far away, over its old quiet hills. The river with the strange soft name is still running the way it ran before that boy was ever born, and the question of that last morning is not going anywhere. It has waited almost 200 years already. It can wait until you wake. Good night. Rest easy. The old story will still be here in the morning, patient as it has always been, and so I hope will you.